Well, why don't you just join our country? You become 51, become the 51st state.
This is Jacob Friedman. Donald Trump looked at the northern border and asked simply, why don't you just join us? Why not become the 51st state? In Ottawa, the polite political class laughed. They treated it as absurdity, the kind of geopolitical nonsense that serious people ignore. But in Alberta and Saskatchewan, nobody was laughing. They were listening. And this week, the laughter in Ottawa died abruptly. Alberta and Saskatchewan have effectively dropped a political bombshell that almost no one in the central Canadian establishment saw coming, openly declaring a push toward 51st and 52nd statehood. It was a brutal line in the sand that shook the federal government to its core. As the fallout began to spread, we saw Mark Carney forced into what can only be described as damage control mode, exposing just how unprepared Canada's leadership was for a crisis of this scale. You need to understand that this isn't just about angry tweets or a few protest signs anymore. Talk of Western separation has arrived on the steps of the Alberta legislature. Hundreds have gathered to advocate for independence while Indigenous groups stand in opposition, creating a volatile mix of constitutional crisis and populist rage. CTV's Kathy Lee reported on the growing divide, noting that this spring has been the worst drought many have lived through in 33 years. Pastures have dried up, leaving ranchers forced to buy feed elsewhere or sell their livestock. These are the material conditions, the dried earth and the empty bank accounts, that turn political frustration into something much more dangerous. What Alberta and Saskatchewan said out loud did not sound reckless or emotional to the people living there. That was the part that rattled Ottawa the most. Two provinces simply stood there and said what had been whispered for years, that staying inside Canada no longer felt sustainable. One press conference was enough to change the national conversation in less than 24 hours. Suddenly, Canadians were no longer arguing about carbon taxes or health care policy. They were arguing about the future of the country itself. We are seeing a new bill in the legislature by Justice Minister Mickey Amery that would make it so any citizen initiative proposal could trigger massive changes. You hear locals saying openly and calmly that they think it is a good idea. They believe it is economically sound. They want control of their own pipelines and to make their own decisions instead of being puppets to Ottawa. The emotional whiplash in the capital was intense. First came denial, then a creeping fear, and finally a quiet panic that spread behind closed doors. People were not asking whether this would blow over. They were asking how far along the West already was. This isn't fiction. This is the jaw-dropping revelation that just sent shockwaves through the entire Canadian establishment. And you need to pay attention because the media is failing to frame this correctly. They are treating it as a stunt. It is not a stunt. It is a divorce proceeding. That question alone, how far gone is this relationship, explains why the response from Ottawa became so controlled and careful so quickly. When governments believe they still have time, they debate. When they believe time is running out, they manage optics. This moment felt like the second one. The feeling of being ripped off is a very strong feeling, a very strong emotion. We are seeing people claiming they are protecting the land and the resources, arguing that when treaties were made, they were a sacred covenant between the people and the crown, and they are not being honored today. Western anger did not appear overnight. It was built slowly, layer by layer, over decades. Alberta and Saskatchewan have long felt treated less like partners in Confederation and more like extraction zones whose primary role was to fund the rest of the country. Energy, grain, and raw materials flowed out while decision-making power flowed east. Over time, a single number became symbolic of that imbalance. For years, that resentment stayed contained within political arguments and election cycles. Then it hardened into identity. Once frustration becomes identity, compromise becomes much harder. People stop believing they are dealing with a system that needs adjustment and start thinking they are trapped in one that does not care. That shift changes everything because dignity is not something voters trade away for promises. We have seen this with his predecessors, and many of the cabinet ministers who were at the table then are going to be at the table now. They had overly aggressive targets that were unachievable. If you try to set an emissions reduction target with a 2030 time frame. That is only 5 years from now. The only way to achieve it is to do less, is to shut in your production. The final breaking point came when economics stopped feeling temporary. Alberta lost more than $200 billion in oil investment, not because the market collapsed, but because projects were delayed, blocked, or buried under endless federal reviews. In the West, Bill C-69 was not seen as environmental stewardship. It was seen as a mechanism designed to make major projects impossible. Investors noticed and moved their capital south. Saskatchewan faced its own crisis as agricultural operating costs surged by as much as 400% under federal regulations that looked manageable in Ottawa, but devastating on the ground. Add in one of the worst droughts in decades, dried out pastures, and forced livestock sales, and the conversation stopped being ideological. It became about survival. That was the moment when people stopped asking whether the system was fair and started asking how to escape it. Once that question takes hold, loyalty to a nation becomes conditional, and that is a dangerous place for any country to be. I think what is good for the country is to listen to what the premiers have all said, to listen to what the people of Canada have said. There is an unprecedented opportunity right now to build those new pipelines so that we have market access to the east, to build north so that we can potentially not only protect our Arctic, but also find a new route over to Europe. But Ottawa failed to recognize the warning signs because it dismissed the movements forming in the West as fringe. The Alberta Prosperity Project was mocked early on until its town halls began filling entire community centers. Then they began repeating over 40 events in just 2 months, with people driving hours from small towns just to hear updates. This was not protest energy. It was organizational energy. Independence committees were quietly forming in places Ottawa never bothered to watch. That turned out to be a critical mistake. I just don't want the sleeping masses to wake up one morning and say, holy smokes, this is real, this is happening. A large investor in Wainwright is the Canadian military, and the mayor is worried about the economic consequences of even talking about separation. At its peak, the turnout rivaled and in some places surpassed the energy seen during the Freedom Convoy, but without the chaos. Oil workers, farmers, families, and Indigenous leaders were showing up together. When groups that rarely agree start standing side by side, political leaders should pay attention. Instead, Ottawa kept calling it fringe. That word aged fast. At some point, this whole thing stopped being loud talk and started turning into paperwork. And that is when Ottawa really started to sweat. December 2025 was the turning point. Alberta didn't just complain or threaten anymore. It got formal approval for a citizen petition that asked a very blunt question about leaving Canada and becoming independent. For the first time, there is now a public timetable. So the plan is for the next 12 to 18 months to let the West decide its own fate. We talked about this, and the signature number scared people at first. 77,000 signatures sounds massive until you remember how motivated the base already was. Alberta Prosperity Project events were already pulling hundreds in person and even more online, sometimes in towns most politicians could not find on a map. When people are angry, organized, and convinced they are being ignored, they sign things. This is heard. We are contracting with folks in America to tell our story that this whole Canadian political narrative that Canadians don't want to be the 51st state is simply not true. Saskatchewan watched all of this and took a slightly different route. Grassroots groups started pushing for a non-binding plebiscite without full government endorsement. That was a strategy. Saskatchewan was testing the waters without lighting every fuse at once. But the intent is the same, the signal is the same, and the danger to the Federation is identical. What really slipped past most Canadians, and this is the detail that keeps political strategists awake at night, was how quietly the rules changed. While the national media was fixated on the usual theater of question period gaffes and scandal mongering, provincial legislation in the West lowered the barriers for citizen initiatives and referendums without fireworks or national headlines. That detail matters immensely. It matters because once the courts approved the wording of Alberta's question exactly as written, the game changed fundamentally. You see, courts do not approve fantasies. They approve mechanisms. That approval was Ottawa's nightmare scenario because it transformed a vague grievance into a legal lever. When a court validates the question, they are validating the process. And once you have a validated process, you are no longer just shouting into the wind, you are standing at a control panel. Then came the polls, and this is where people misunderstand the panic that is currently gripping the Liberal war room. Angus Reid showed around 50% support for leaving Canada in Alberta and Saskatchewan. That number made headlines, but it was not the real threat. If you look closely at the data, the real story was underneath it. A huge chunk of those supporters were what we call conditional leavers. They were not burning flags in the streets. They were saying, fix pipelines, stop blocking projects, treat us fairly, and we might stay. Ottawa saw that data point and thought it still had leverage. And they looked at those conditional voters and thought, we can negotiate with them. We can offer a tax credit here, a consultation there. But that was a miscalculation of historic proportions. They failed to understand that the conditionality was expiring. The federal government is talking about export tariffs on Alberta oil and gas or export bans, thinking this is a negotiating tactic. They are the ones saying that nothing is off the table. The response from the West was immediate and devastating. If that is not off the table, then the 51st state is not off the table. The confidence that Ottawa could manage this situation evaporated when support began to cross 60% in key United Conservative Party regions. Once movements cross that line, they stop being political preferences and start becoming emotional commitments. At that point, people are not comparing platforms or tax brackets. They are defending their identity. And here's the dangerous part that Mark Carney and his team are only now beginning to grasp. Leveraging politics can accidentally turn permanent. You threaten separation to get attention, and suddenly you realize too many people actually want it. Momentum does not ask for permission. This brings us to Mark Carney. The man has been positioned as the savior of the liberal brand, the technocrat who understands global finance and can steady the ship. But watch his reaction to this crisis. Publicly, Mark Carney stayed calm because he had to. Leaders rarely panic on camera unless they have already lost control, and Carney is nothing if not disciplined. But behind the scenes, the urgency was apparent. We saw emergency meetings, rapid messaging shifts, and a sudden, desperate willingness to engage with Western concerns that had been dismissed for years. The absence of a visible screaming tantrum on the nightly news did not mean there was no fear. It meant the fear was being managed. Ottawa's real fear was not separation itself. They still think that is unlikely. Their fear was timing. If this moved too fast, the federal government would be reacting instead of controlling the sequence. Governments hate losing the clock more than they hate losing arguments. If a majority on a clear question votes to leave Confederation, and remember, the legal precedent regarding Quebec applies just as much or almost as much to Alberta and Saskatchewan, then an obligation would fall upon the federal government to negotiate in good faith. That is the legal reality. But practically, basically, that has never happened, and those are qualitative rather than quantitative criteria. But the possibility of separation is still stronger than some of those numbers indicate in that poll because of the movements taking shape on the ground. The sound reverberated off the stone walls of the Alberta Legislature building recently. Hundreds supporting the separatist movement gathered in Edmonton, denouncing federal policies. They were shouting that they have been dominated by Eastern politicians and Eastern politics. And then there was the part that made everything exponentially more serious. The American shadow. When Donald Trump said, "Why don't you just join us and become the 51st state?" much of Canada laughed. The pundits on CBC laughed. The columnists in Toronto laughed. But Western leaders did not laugh. They heard it as a signal. Eastern media treated it like a joke. Prairie politicians treated it like an opening. Reports started circulating that U.S. officials viewed Western independence as a strategic win for energy security, pipelines, and continental defense. That changes the math instantly. It shifts the conversation from a domestic dispute to a geopolitical realignment. We are looking at a provincial referendum so that all Albertans can vote on this sometime in 2026. To be clear, the provincial government says it will not be putting a vote on separation from Canada on the referendum ballot immediately, but the door is being propped open. That is where Project Buffalo entered the conversation, mostly in whispers at first. Allegations of a U.S.-led plan to integrate Western Canadian oil directly into the American energy grid without Ottawa's control started to surface. Imagine that scenario. No federal regulators, no endless reviews, just continental infrastructure acting as if the border were already thinner. Saskatchewan is exploring grain export routes that bypass Canada entirely, which only reinforce that feeling. When regions start routing trade around their own country, that is not protest. That is preparation. Psychologically, this was huge. People began acting like the border had already shifted, even if legally it had not. History shows that economic integration almost always comes before political separation. I feel we can have a better relationship with Canada once we are independent. That is what locals are hoping for and praying for. You have industry veterans like Don Bonner, an oil industry veteran of 45 years, saying he likes the idea that within 5 years of Alberta's independence, income tax could evaporate. He believes the province could generate 45 to 65 billion annually to help fix its social programs like health care. Whether those numbers are accurate is almost beside the point. The point is that people believe them. They see a future where the province could have a better deal with Indigenous people, and that is a crucial piece of this puzzle. And just when Ottawa thought this could not get more complicated, Indigenous treaty rights entered the frame. Treaty 6. First Nations filed for intervenor status. Suddenly, this was no longer just provinces versus Ottawa. It became a constitutional maze. Sovereignty raised one brutal question. If Alberta or Saskatchewan left, who would inherit the treaty obligations? Canada, the new state, both? No one had clean answers, and that uncertainty pulled courts, governments, and institutions into the fight. Whether they wanted to be there or not, that moment changed the legitimacy debate. This was no longer just about angry provinces. It was about law, history, and responsibility. Every lever of the Canadian system was now involved. By this point, the separation conversation had outgrown rallies and slogans. It had become systems, documents, meetings, and timelines. And that is when Ottawa realized something uncomfortable. This was not a bluff. It was a mechanism already in motion. We have seen support from Western Canadians grow ever since U.S. President Donald Trump suggested Canada join the United States. And as tensions between the two countries rise, the establishment is realizing they are losing the narrative war. At this point, the story took a turn that made even seasoned political watchers stop and reread the page. What people started calling the Wexit papers surfaced quietly. At first, they were brushed off as internet fiction, just more conspiracy chatter on the fringes. That is, until they were not. Portions of those documents were verified, and the mood shifted fast. It is really unfortunate that at this moment, when Western Canada is stepping into the spotlight, there is any discussion at all about leaving Canada. You hear disappointment from leaders like BC's Premier heading to the Western Premiers Conference, noting that the issue of Western separatism hangs over it like a dark cloud. But the most unsettling part of these papers was how ordinary they looked. We weren't looking at manifestos written in crayon. We were looking at flowcharts breaking down U.S. statehood procedures like someone was studying for a civics exam. If Ottawa refuses, move to Plan B. That is not the language of protest. That is the language of contingency planning. Then came references to a drafted Western Sovereignty Act with actual timelines attached. And then there was the detail that really made jaws tighten in the finance department, a dual currency transition plan. Preparing to operate with both the Canadian dollar and the US dollar at the same time is not an accounting exercise. That is a psychological point of no return. Once people start getting comfortable with another currency, they are already halfway out the door mentally. You do not plan to live in two monetary worlds unless you think one of them is temporary. For the first time, there is now a public timetable. So the plan is for the next 12 to 18 months to let the West decide its own fate. This is where Ottawa's options narrowed fast. A referendum mechanics matter. If a clear majority votes yes, the federal government is legally bound to negotiate. It cannot pretend it did not hear the answer. That is why last-minute concessions, the kind Mark Carney might be cooking up right now, may not work. When separation becomes identity rather than a policy preference, promises sound like noise. By then, the West will no longer look east for approval. It is looking south for alignment. That is the moment Canada cannot undo. The countdown has started, and the only real question left is not whether things will change, but who blinks first. Does Canada fracture under the pressure, or does Ottawa finally move before the line is crossed? This brings us to the bigger lesson, the one that goes beyond pipelines or transfer payments. What is happening in Western Canada is a warning sign for every democracy in the West. We are witnessing what happens when a technocratic center loses the ability to speak to or even understand its periphery. The system Mark Carney represents, global, interconnected, focused on macroeconomic indicators and climate accords, has failed to account for the visceral local reality of place and identity. The tantrum attributed to Carney is really the panic of an elite class, realizing that their expertise has no currency in a room where people feel betrayed. They are realizing that you cannot regulate away resentment. You cannot effectively tax a population that has already mentally seceded. This is not an accident. It is the inevitable result of a worldview that prioritized global acceptance over domestic cohesion for too long. We need to follow the power here. Who benefits if Canada fractures? Certainly American energy interests are watching with keen interest. The absorption of Western Canada's resources into a U.S. continental model is a strategic dream for Washington, regardless of who sits in the Oval Office. But the people who pay the price will be ordinary Canadians on both sides of the new border, who lose the stability of a G7 nation to become smaller players in a chaotic global game. The tragedy is that this could have been avoided. It could have been addressed with genuine partnership instead of performative consultation. But now the momentum is on the side of the exit. The Wexit papers and the dual currency plans are not hallucinations. They are blueprints, and blueprints, once drawn, have a way of demanding to be built. So where does this leave us? We are standing on a precipice. The next few months will not be decided by court rulings or federal budgets. They will be decided by whether Ottawa can offer a vision of Canada that includes the West not as a reluctant colony, but as a central pillar. If they cannot, if the response remains condescending lectures about international obligations, then the map of North America is going to change. We need to stop asking, is this legal? And start asking, is this retrievable? Because right now the answer looks increasingly like no. The psychological border has already moved. The political border is just waiting for the ink to dry. I want you to think about that the next time you hear a politician brush this off as fringe. Look at the numbers. Look at the dried out fields. Look at the plans being drafted in quiet meeting rooms. This is the story of our time. It is the story of a breaking point. I'm Jacob Friedman, and this is the reality we have to face. If you found this analysis useful, if you think we need to keep digging into the stories the establishment ignores, please like this video and subscribe. We need to build a community that understands the stakes because the history books are being written right now, and we all need to be reading the fine print.